Go. All right, so first of all, we're going to review some things that if you've been in here, you've already heard. But let's make sure. One of the last things we talked about last week was how archaea and eubacteria are similar but still different. Let's first of all talk about the similarities. Just remember, for a long time, they were grouped in the same kingdom. So some things that are similar. They're both prokaryotic. No membrane-bound nucleus. None of the typical membrane-bound organelles. They both have walls. Now, their walls are made in very different ways, but they both do have cell walls. They're fairly similar in terms of their size and their shape. And they reproduce mostly the same way, which is essentially what? Binary fission, asexual. So those are a bunch of similarities. Over here in the right column, we're looking more at differences between the two. Archaea, let's say they have cell walls, but their cell walls don't have this stuff. Oops, that didn't work so well, did it? I guess the pen's not going to cooperate right now. So archaea, their cell walls have a lot of different kinds of lipids in them, whereas eubacteria have this peptidoglycan material, which is kind of unique to regular bacteria. It's part sugar, part protein. One of the main reasons that they broke the two groups apart and classified them differently now is that archaea seem to have a lot of characteristics that are more similar to what? Eukaryotes. For example, the archaea ribosomes and their rRNA are more similar to what we have than they are to regular bacteria. I'm going to skip this one right here. I'll come back to it in a second. Archaea also have histone proteins. Eubacteria don't. What are histones? This is something you need to know. Something we haven't talked much about. Say again? Yeah, they're proteins that the DNA winds around, and it helps to organize the DNA, especially when the DNA is trying to become a what? Chromosome. Think of it almost like a spool. But they're not just important when cell division is happening. They're also important at other times. They're proteins that the DNA helps to that the DNA spools around, and they help to organize the DNA. We have them as eukaryotes. So do archaea. Eubacteria don't. So again, that implies that archaea are more related to eukaryotes than regular eubacteria are. Another thing, as far as we know, there aren't any archaea that make us sick. There aren't any pathogenic archaea. All the bacteria that make us sick are eubacteria. Even so, most eubacteria don't make us sick either, right? There's only a handful. Most of them are good. Most of them aren't going to hurt us. But as far as we know, no archaea are pathogenic. The other thing that I'll mention, it says here, eubacteria can form endospores, archaea can't. I wish I could draw it on that board. I don't guess I can. So I'll do it over here. Let's say that this is a regular eubacteria cell. I'm not going to draw the wall, otherwise there will be a wall there too. Here's this little chromosome. And let's say it's in an environment that's getting bad. Maybe it's really cold. Maybe it's living in a puddle and the water's drying up and it's becoming salty. Something's happening to the environment. When the environment starts getting really bad, it makes a thick coat around its DNA. That's called an endospore. The cell dies. But that thick coat, that endospore, is resistant to bad environments. And when the environment gets better, this thing will essentially grow into another bacteria. So it helps eubacteria to resist bad climates. helps them live through bad times. So those are some similarities and some differences. Anybody have questions on those? All right. The other topic we want to hit today is protists. Now, protists are thought to be the first eukaryotes. And remember that they supposedly came from bacteria. And we think that protists developed by two mechanisms. One of them is endosymbiosis, which we talked about over and over and over. What are some organelles that supposedly came about by endosymbiosis? Mitochondria, chloroplast, maybe something else. Maybe flagella. But we said that doesn't explain a lot of the organelles. Because a lot of the organelles are essentially just little sacs, right? What was the idea that supposedly explains how those little sac-like organisms came to be? Membrane invagination. So we're saying that some bacteria-like prokaryotes, through endosymbiosis, through membrane invagination, eventually created the first eukaryotes, which were protists. Protists are a varied group. And as I've said in class before, most of the textbooks don't consider Protista a kingdom anymore. Because what kind of classification system are we using today? Phylogenetic. And as they started looking at the genetics of these things we've been calling protists for all these years, what have they found? They're very, very different. They don't seem to be closely related at all, so it doesn't make sense to put them in a kingdom anymore. So where they put them right now is sort of up for grabs. They don't really fit anywhere, which is kind of strange. It makes the system hard to think about. People who do this kind of thing, taxonomists, are still kind of figuring out where they should go. What we've called protists for years, though, there's really two big groups of them. There's the algae, which are more like plants, and the protozoans, which are more like animals. We're going to talk about the protozoans mostly first, but before we do, most protists are single-celled. They're all eukaryotic. They can be autotrophic, some of them are, and again, that means what? Autotrophic. Self-feeding. They can make their own food somewhere, or they're usually photosynthesis. A lot of them are heterotrophic, more like animals. And as I said earlier, most of them are unicellular. There are a few that aren't, like off the coast of California in cold water ocean environments. There are these huge algae. Anybody know what I'm talking about? They're almost like forests under the ocean. Kelp. Those have been considered protists for a long time. Those are definitely not single-celled things. But they're groups of cells that sort of work together in what we call colonies. All right, the protozoans, the ones that are more animal-like, they're classified based on how they move. So we're going to talk about four main groups of protozoans in a few minutes, based on the different ways that they can move. Protozoans are more animal-like. They don't have cell walls. They can move. They're motile. Motile just means able to move. Protists that we call algae, they can do photosynthesis. So they're classified based on the different kinds of pigments that they have. Remember that pigments are proteins. Proteins that absorb some kinds of light, reflect other kinds. Some of the more complicated algae, the more multicellular ones, are classified as plants. Because that's where scientists think plants came from, right? These algae. A lot of the algae form phytoplankton. Don't know that some of you might have heard this before. What is PHYT? Whenever you see those words, what should you think? PHY and T when they're together. Like a plant. So that means plant-like, and plankton. What does plankton mean? Plankton are things that float. Can't swim on their own, they float. So essentially it means floating plant-like stuff. Now, if you've been in some of the other study sessions, we mentioned a couple of other words that I'll throw up here just as a reminder. In the oceans, you have plankton that floats on top, and then underneath that you have things that can swim, like fish. What do we call those kinds of things? They're called nectin, or sometimes you might hear it called nectose. So those are the swimmers. And then the things that live on the bottom, what are they called? Benthic or benthos. Also remember that your algae, a lot of them can undergo blooms, which is when they grow out of control. And what's usually the cause of that? There's too much of some nutrient in the water that more than likely got to air how? We put it there in one way or another most of the time. Either through farming, or through like factory waste, or through some kind of sewage system kind of thing. And those minerals usually act as what to control the algae population? Limiting factors. If there's a bunch of those minerals in the water now, they're not limiting anymore. There's a bunch of them, and so the algae grow like crazy. That's a bloom. All right, this phylogenetic tree didn't turn out so well on this slide, but what it's supposed to show you is here in green, these are all the plants. In blue are all the animals. In yellow, all the fungi. So what's this little purple line supposed to represent? Yeah, which is? Protists. The blue line's supposed to be the protists. So this is supposed to be all eukaryotes, and it's supposed to show you that they started as protists, and that different things branched off that tree over time. Oops. Carried away. All right, so let's talk about some protozoan groups here first. First protozoan group we'll talk about is called Mastigophora or Zoomastogyna. And these things move with a flagella. Remember, protozoans are classified based on how they move. So this group has a flagella, long tail-like whip. The things in this group are heterotrophic, although there's a couple that can do photosynthesis, but mostly heterotrophic. They have these little things called contractile vacuoles. And this ties into what we've been talking about in class. These are freshwater mostly. What's the major problem if you're a little freshwater organism? What's a big environmental problem for you if you're a freshwater organism? What's constantly happening to your body? Water is coming which way? Into you. From less solute concentration in the water to more solute concentration in you. These things don't have kidneys. So the way they get rid of that extra water is they have these little vacuoles, contractile vacuoles, that collect extra water and then pump it out. They're constantly pumping out extra water. That's what those little vacuoles do. Pump out extra water. They reproduce a lot like bacteria. It's not exactly binary fission, but it's pretty close. It's asexual. Some examples that you may or may not have heard of before. This first one, Giardia. Anybody ever heard of that before? Giardia? Where have you heard of it? Oh. Really? I never heard of a cat getting it before. How do you catch it? Do you know how you catch it? You get it from drinking fresh water that hasn't been purified. So say you're out hiking in the mountains, and there's this beautiful looking stream. It looks crystal clear. It's cold. You're hot. You're sweaty. You didn't bring enough water. you drink some of it, thinking you're okay because it looks so clear and pure. It may not be. That's where these kinds of things live. And when they get in you, they essentially cause really, really bad diarrhea. It's called camper's diarrhea. That's what they call it. And they're hard to treat. It's not like a bacterial infection. Antibiotics will work on these things. And medicines that will kill them will probably going to hurt your cells too, because their cells are sort of like your cells. It's kind of hard to get rid of. Another scary one, and I think I have some pictures of this one later on, is the trypanosome. This thing causes a disorder called African sleeping sickness. Anybody ever heard of that? African sleeping sickness. How do you get them? You get them through a bug bite. It's not mosquitoes this time, though. There are these flies in Africa called tsetse flies. And when these flies bite you, they can inject these trypanosomes into you. It works a lot like mosquito-borne diseases. It's called African sleeping sickness because these things essentially get into your brain and they make you go into a coma that you may or may not ever wake up from. It's kind of scary. Not that common, but there's certain parts of Africa where it's endemic. It's there, and you need to be careful if you're in those areas. Again, I'll show you some pictures of those in a minute. Just two examples of protozoans that move with flagella. Next group is class Ciliata, and these obviously move with little cilia. They also, in addition to using the cilia to move, they also have cilia around their mouth opening. It's called the oral groove, and they use it almost like a little broom to sweep the food into their mouth holes. Like the first group, they're mostly freshwater dwellers, so they have to have a way to get out that water, the extra water. So they too have contractile vacuoles. And they can undergo conjugation, sort of like bacteria. What did bacteria do when they conjugated? You know, what did they swap? Yeah, what are the little things called? Plasmids. Plasmids, not plastids, plasmids. They swap little pieces of DNA to get what? What are they going for? Genetic variation. Well, these don't have plasmids, but the ciliates have two nuclei. They have a large nucleus and a small nucleus, and they can swap the small one, changing some DNA. We call it the micronucleus. But they can also reproduce asexually, almost like binary fission. The famous one of these, one that you've probably all heard of, is the paramecium. There's another one, Stentor. I doubt you've heard of that one before. But paramecium is the famous one. All right, then moving on down the list. Third group is class Sarcodina. And these move with pseudopods. What does that mean? Pseudopod. False foot. They don't have feet. These are like amoebas. So they essentially just float. It's like a blob almost. It just flows to where it goes. And a piece of its body will stick out, and then the rest of it will flow to that point. That part that sticks out is the pseudopod. We'll see pictures of that here in just a minute. These things usually feed by phagocytosis. So they surround and engulf usually other protists. We've got a video on the next slide where we watch an amoeba eat a paramecium. They too tend to reproduce asexually. Like the other two groups, they have those little contractile vacuoles that help pump out water. There are some that build essentially like cases around themselves. One group, called foraminifera, these guys build cases out of this stuff, CaCO3. What is that? CaCO3. Calcium carbonate, better known to your average person as what? Calcium carbonate, better known to your average non-chemist. It's limestone. You know, around here there's lots of limestone. County next door is Limestone County. Turns out that limestone, more than likely, came from the shells of these things. Deposited, built up over time. All right, there's another weird group, and I've got pictures of this later too, called radiolarans. These guys make a case around themselves out of silica. What's that? It's essentially glass. They have this glass-like shell around themselves. Pretty cool to look at. Again, I'll show you some of those in a minute. But by far the most famous member of this group is the amoeba. And, you know, amoebas are in fresh water all over the place. But amoebas, depending on the type of amoeba it is, they can do some damage to you. Probably the most famous thing that amoebas cause in terms of disease is dysentery. It's called amoebic dysentery. And again, that's another form of what? Really bad diarrhea that you get from drinking unpurified water. But what's been in the news lately about amoebas? Around here. The brain-eating amoebas. Where do you catch brain-eating amoebas? You're swimming in like a lake or a pond. Apparently they go in through your sinuses, get into your brain, and feed on it, literally. Deadly, almost always. But rare, not something you need to be completely scared of. But in the past year, there's been 4 or 5 cases of that around here. People picked up at either Gunnersville or Scottsboro, places like that, out in the lake. All right, the last group, Sporozoa. This group is non-motile, which means on their own they can't really move. They don't have cilia, flagella, pseudopods. But even though they're non-motile, scientists think that they're the most advanced in terms of evolution. The reason they think that is that these are parasites and that they've evolved with a host. When things evolve together, we call that coevolution. So they've co-evolved with a host or a group of hosts. Probably the most famous one of these is this one, Plasmodium. Anybody know what that causes? Plasmodium, what disease? What's probably the most serious protist disease in humans? It's killed more people than just about anything ever. Malaria. It's a protist-borne disease. So Plasmodium is the protist that causes malaria. How did you catch malaria if you got it? You got it from a mosquito bite. And what part of a mosquito have these things evolved to live in? They've evolved to live in the salivary glands. They don't hurt the mosquito. But what does a mosquito do before it bites a mammal? It spits on them. What's in that spit other than these things? Yeah, a chemical to essentially make pain go away so you don't feel it when they bite you. And also a chemical to do what? To keep your blood from clotting. So the mosquito is injecting you with 2 drugs, essentially. And in the meantime, it's also injecting you with these things because these organisms have evolved to live there. It's a perfect transport mechanism for them. Once they get into your blood, where the mosquito puts them, then what do they start to do? What does malaria do to you? What's the main part of your body that it impacts? It essentially eats your red blood cells. That's why the first symptom of malaria is what? You start feeling really weak. Why would that make sense? Can't transport enough oxygen, therefore you can't do enough what? So respiration, therefore you don't have enough what? ATP. You need to do stuff. So Plasmodium is by far the most famous one. This guy, Pneumocystis carnii, probably never heard of it before. None of you are probably ever going to get infected by it. But it's very dangerous to people with HIV. The AIDS usually kill a person who has it. That's not usually what they die of. They usually die of some infection that a normal person would never get. And in a lot of those cases, it's this. This stuff causes a form of pneumonia that your average person is just never going to get because your immune system will kill it. But since people with HIV essentially don't have an immune system, it can be deadly. The last one, I'll just briefly mention it, toxoplasma. This one, you guys ever heard of that pregnant women should stay away from cats? You guys ever heard of that? Pregnant women should stay away from cats, especially cat litter boxes. These things like to live in cat waste. And if you're pregnant, if this germ typically doesn't affect a normal person, but a person who's pregnant can get an infection and can cause miscarriage, like spontaneous miscarriage. So if you're pregnant, you should stay away from cat poop, is what I'm telling you. Avoid cat poop if you're pregnant. All right, so those are our four main groups of protozoans. Animal-like, single-celled eukaryotes. And this next slide is a little video clip. And I need to do this. Well, I'll have to try it. All right, so here we go. So here's an amoeba, and you can see it phagocytizing the paramecium. Two of them. And once it's in there, paramecium figures out something's up. What's this? What's probably being dumped into that vacuole now? Enzymes from the lysosomes, right? And it's breaking it down, digesting it, and that thing's being digested alive, essentially. We call that intracellular digestion. Now, I don't think that was in real time, but still kind of cool. Not if you're paramecium. All right, so winding up our study session topic for today, talking a little bit about the groups of algae. Remember, these are the plant-like protists. And the first group of those we'll mention is this group called Chrysophila. These are the golden algae. Remember, they're classified based on their pigments. So these actually look sort of yellowish golden. It's mostly because of the pigment that they have called fucoxanthin. These things are probably the most important producers, probably in the world, but for sure in marine environments, in the ocean. You've been told your whole life, most photosynthesis happens where? The rainforest. Somebody lied to you. Most photosynthesis happens in the oceans. And the main photosynthesizers in the world are these guys. They're the ones that do most of our photosynthesis for us. They have cell walls. And those cell walls are made out of this stuff called pectin. And they also may have silica, which again, we said silica a minute ago is what? Glass. You notice that on the beaches, there's these little glass-like particles in the sand, right? Most of that is from the shells of these. Also, you ever notice in your toothpaste, the crunchy-like stuff inside your toothpaste? It's the shells of these things. They put it in there to rub. On like an emery board, that you do your nails on, the little glassy-like particles on the emery board, shells of these things. So the sandpaper, shells of these things. So they have lots of uses. Other than the fact that they're the most important producers in the world, we use their shells, their glass-like shells, for several things. My favorite group of algae, just because I think they're kind of cool, is a group called Pyrophyta. Literally, that name means fiery plants, right? Fiery plants. We call them the fire algae sometimes. They too are single-celled photosynthesizers. And they're an important part of the food chain too. They may or may not have a cell wall. Some of them do, some don't. But a lot of them, the reason they're called Pyrophyta is they can do bioluminescence. A lot of them can. And that's what bioluminescence. They light up. There are parts of the world where you can go through the water in your little boat and all of a sudden the water starts to glow. That'd be very eerie at night. But it happens. The most famous member of this group is an organism called the dinoflagellate, which we've mentioned in here before. These are the ones that when they bloom cause the red tides, to make the water turn red. And we mentioned that causes a lot of fish to die in the area because they're poisonous. But it doesn't kill what? Shellfish, clams, and oysters and such. But the poison, like a lot of poisons, is soluble in what? Nope, no water. Fat. It's fat soluble. Which means when you eat the poison, what happens? It stays in you, and it accumulates. Which is important for this reason. Each dinoflagellate doesn't have a lot of poison. But what's that going to mean about shellfish? They're going to have a lot more because they eat a lot of dinoflagellates. And if something eats shellfish, they're going to have even more. That pattern of toxins building up as you go through the food chain is called either bioaccumulation or biological magnification. That's an important pattern. It's the way poisons usually work. They affect the top of the food chain the worst. What's the most famous organism that was being killed off by DDT, the pesticide? The bald eagle. They were dying because of this pesticide. We weren't trying to kill bald eagles with DDT. We were trying to kill what? What were we trying to kill with DDT? Insects. Do bald eagles eat insects? No. But they eat things that eventually ate bugs. And the pesticide built up through the food chain. Same kind of thing here. If you were to eat one of these shellfish, you'd probably die because it can cause what's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. Paralysis, especially of your diaphragm, can't breathe, you die. Not a pretty picture. All right, our last group is called Euglenophyta. And these are the euglenas, which we've seen several times in here already. These are kind of cool because they are sort of like plants and animals put into one organism. They have chlorophyll, two kinds of chlorophyll, A and B, just like plants. They have carotenoid pigments. Those would be what color? Carotenoid. Orangish. Plants have those too. So they can do photosynthesis. But they have a flagella, which means they can move. And they have a little eye spot. Now they can't see the way we see. The eye spot is essentially what? It's a light detector. And which way are they always going to move? Toward the light, because they can do photosynthesis. Now, they're freshwater. So they have those little contractile vacuoles to pump out extra water. But one of the cool things about them is when there's not enough light, what happens? They start eating. And they eat other protists, bacteria. So like I said, they can move. they can eat. So that's a lot like an animal. But then on the other hand, they have chlorophyll and they can do photosynthesis, which just makes them sort of like plants. So they're sort of somewhere in between plants and animals. All right, I have lots of pictures to show you. And we will end with some pictures. So this is the diatom. These are the golden algae. You can see why they're called the golden algae. But remember, these shells are made of essentially glass, silica. That's the little glassy particles mostly that you see in the sand. This is a dinoflagellate. This is the guy that causes the red tide. There's a euglena. Again, you can see the flagella. There's a little red eye spot up here that helps it detect light. You can see all the little chloroplast inside. It's a eukaryote, so there's the nucleus. All right, here's our amoeba. And again, each of these little extensions, those are what? Pseudopods, false feet. But again, you can see the nucleus. You can see lots of little vacuoles in there. Here's this contractile vacuole to get rid of water. There's a mitochondrion. All right, this is a foraminifera. This is the one that makes a shell that's essentially made out of limestone, calcium carbonate. That's a radiolarian. That's the one that makes essentially a glass shell around itself. Kind of cool glass shell. All right, here's the paramecium. It's one of the ciliates. I told you before, it sort of looks like a hairy shoe. What it does. There's contractile vacuoles to get rid of water. There's its little mouth opening, oral groove. Remember, it's one of the ones that have two nuclei, so that when they conjugate, they can swap that little nucleus to get some variation. And there they are conjugating. So they're attached, they're exchanging genetic information to essentially make genetic variation. It's a stentor, which you may or may not have seen before. This is the plasmodium. Now remember, this is the one that causes malaria. So it's living in the salivary glands of the mosquito. Once the mosquito bites you, it goes into your body, it gets into your liver. I'm not sure why it goes to your liver first, but that's the way it's evolved. And then it bursts out of your liver and it starts feeding on your red blood cells, causing all kinds of problems all over your body. This one, this is the trypanosome. And this is in blood. So these are blood cells, these round things are. This is the little trypanosome. That's the one that causes the sleeping sickness, African sleeping sickness. Didn't mention this guy right here. That guy right there is called trichonympha. And it's found in termite guts. Pretty important for termites, because what does it do? It digests cellulose for them. So it's not a bacteria, it's a protist living in termite guts. Something that we do in this class a lot, I'm not sure if we'll get around to it this year or not, is we'll take some termites. I'll go out in the woods and find some termites. We take them and put them on slide, stitch rip their head off, squish them, and we look at them under a microscope. And in their gut, you can see these things swimming around, and most of them have little wood particles inside, and it's kind of cool to look at. And that's where we will end. You know, they're just termites.